Welcome to the Tech Talk EMEA series by Microsoft EMEA. Today we have 60 minutes for your questions around Microsoft technologies. So you can use the chat and the comment functionality on YouTube to ask your questions about Microsoft licensing, Microsoft technologies. So every question is welcome. There's a small delay between what I am telling and your feedback to my channel, to my tool here where we are streaming. So don't wonder if you write something down and it takes a while till I can pick up the question. For starting the session, for sure, you can give me feedback if the audio is fine, if video is fine, if you can hear me, and so we can test if the communication works, if everything is fine. Till your first questions arrive, I will use a few minutes to tell you what our next sessions will be about, because if you have been in the Tech Talks before, we have the Tech Talk Q&A for your questions, and we have the Tech Talks with technical content. If you are in a Tech Talk for the first time, then let me introduce you to you. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. My main focus topics are Windows Server, including licensing, Azure Stack HCI, System Center topics, SQL Server, but for sure you can also ask me about Windows Client, about Microsoft 365, Autopilot, and technologies like this. Sven is also in the call, so hello Sven, nice to have you here. And Sven sends an hello to the EMEA community. And for sure, you can also send your comments if you have special topics you would like to have in one of these Tech Talks. Feel free to send them as a comment via the platform where you are watching, and then we will try to bring them in a Q&A session or in one of the next Tech Talks. When we have a short look about the next dates, then we have the situation, the next Tech Talk about technologies, about Microsoft technologies, will be on the 16th of May at 12 p.m. Central Eastern Time, and it's about Azure Stack HCI concepts and benefits. And you're watching this Tech Talk on the YouTube channel of Sven Langenfeld. He's also attending this live stream, or youtube.com/Manfred Helber. We are streaming on both YouTube channels. And on 16th of May, we have Azure Stack HCI, the concepts and benefits. I would absolutely recommend you to attend this session, because there we will have a lot of information about this great technology to bring Azure workloads on premises. On the 23rd of May at 12 p.m. Central Eastern Time, we have Azure Stack HCI, how to deploy. It's including live demo. And the next Q&A will be on 24th of May, where you have, again, 1 hour for your questions. And on May 30th, we have the Azure Stack HCI Management by a Windows Admin Center, also including the live demo there to see how we manage it. So feel free to send your questions. Sven has a comment. He says, as SQL Server 2012 is going end of support, could you explain how to license SQL Server in the actual version? For sure, I can do this. Let's talk a little bit about this end of support situation. So when we are thinking about end of support of Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, we have the situation that the Windows Server operating system reaches the end of support date in October 2023. The exact date is the 10th of October 2023. But you don't have only to look at the server operating system, but also onto the workload. And when we are looking at the workload of Microsoft SQL Server, then we have the situation that SQL Server 2012 is going end of support in July of this year already. So we have now May, June, July, it's close, it's nearby. So if you are running SQL Server 2012 on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2, you have to focus absolutely on this migration to a later version because the end of support is even closer than to to the Windows Server operating system. And regarding to the comment Sven had to speak a little bit about SQL Server, I think it's important to first understand how Windows Server is licensed. Windows Server licensing, we discussed this in a preview EMEA call. There we have the situation that we have to license each core on our physical host, minimum 16 cores, but all the cores we have inside the server. Minimum 8 cores per CPU, minimum 16 cores per server. All the cores we have in the server have to be licensed. So if we have an 8-core server, we have to license 16 cores. If we have a 20-core server, we have to license 20 cores. All the cores in the server, minimum 16. We always license the physical hardware. This is also important to understand regarding the Windows Server licensing. When it comes to SQL Server, then we have the situation that the SQL Server knows 4 editions. Windows Server knows 3 editions, Essentials, Standard, and Data Center. The SQL Server knows 4 editions. Express and Developer, these 2 licenses are free editions, so I can download them from Microsoft. The Express edition is an edition that's limited from the technical scalability. The Developer edition is identical to the Enterprise edition, but we are not allowed to use the Developer edition in a production environment. So please never host your production database on Developer Edition or your production CRM system on Developer Edition. Developer Edition, as the name explains, it's for development, it's for testing, but it's also for training. If you want to train people on SQL Server, if you want to have workshops on SQL Server, you could also use the Developer Edition. Standard and Enterprise are the 2 SQL Server editions we use mostly at customers. And with Standard and Enterprise, the first thing that's different to Windows Server is the naming. Yes, Windows Server, let's say the smaller version, is also the Standard, but the version including all the features in Windows Server is in Windows Server the Data Center edition. In SQL Server, it's the Enterprise edition here. So the naming is different compared to the operating system. Yes, SQL Server is also available on SQL Server platform, but SQL Server, I will talk about installing SQL Server on Windows Server. So there are 2 different major licensing options. The Standard edition can be licensed in a combination of a server license and additionally a client access license for each user that wants to access this server. As we can see here, this licensing option is not available for Enterprise edition, only for Standard edition. For the for the second licensing option per core, where we are focused on the cores, we don't need any additional client access licenses. And this is different to Windows Server because your Windows Server is also licensed based on the cores, but additionally, you need the Windows Server client access licenses to access the Windows Server operating system or to consume Windows Server services. In SQL Server Standard and Enterprise, we have the option to license per core. And in this situation, we don't need any additional SQL Server client access licenses. So how does this work and look in detail? Let's imagine we have a customer environment where we have 2 SQL servers. Here in this scenario, these are virtual machines. This could also be physical servers. We have 2 SQL servers, And these two SQL servers here are running in virtual machines. One virtual machine has 2 virtual CPUs, and the other virtual machine has 4 virtual CPUs. For sure, they can also have more virtual CPUs. And in the licensing model, server plus client access license, we will buy a server license, SQL Server license for each of the servers, here for each of the VMs. So one license for this machine and one license for this machine. But now we have users that access the server. Here we have user A, we have the user B, and we have user C. And these users, they need client access licenses, not for each server, but for the user to have the ability to have the access right to access SQL Server in your environment. So here we can see, okay, we have one client access license for user A, one for user B, and one for user C. So in this scenario, we have 2 server licenses for SQL Server and 3 total client access licenses, not 6. This is a misunderstanding we often have also for Windows Server. We don't need the client access licenses for each server. We need the client access license for the user or for the device. And with the client access license, we have the right to access each server in the network that has an operating system that is not newer than the client access license version. So with the 2019 SQL Server client access license, we can access SQL Server 2019, 2016, 2012, and so on, but not a later SQL Server version when it's released. It's the same in Windows Server. With Windows Server 2022 client access license, we can access the latest version of Windows Server, but also 2019, 2016, 2012 R2, and so on. So if we're running SQL Server on a Windows Server, we need the Windows Server licensing, we need the Windows Server client access licenses, we need the SQL Server licenses, and the SQL Server client access licenses. Important is, if you're running any middleware, so for example, in CRM and customer relationship management or an ERP solution, so any web-based or locally installed software that is accessed by your user and that uses the database in the backend, there you also need client access licenses for each user. So not for the middleware, but for each user, because the licensing terms of SQL Server say we need a license, a client access license in this scenario for each user that is accessing SQL Server directly or indirectly. The other option is where you decide to license based on the CPU cores, because maybe you have too many users that want to access the server, where you have huge costs because of the client access licenses, or maybe you don't know the number of users that will access your SQL Server. Then we have to switch to the core-based model. Before we switch to the core-based licensing, one important thing to add here, this option we see here on the slide is only available with SQL Server Standard. This is not an option for Enterprise. So if you need the Enterprise features, you have to decide for the core-based licensing. And SQL Server Standard, from the technical perspective, only supports maximum 4 CPU cores, 4 CPU sockets, it's sockets, and maximum 24 CPU cores. So I mentioned these virtual machines here in this graphics could have more virtual CPUs, but maximum 24. 24 is the technical limit in cores that SQL Server Standard supports. SQL Server Enterprise is scalable to the maximum of the OS supported number of cores. And for the core-based model, there are 2 different options how to license. There's an option to license based on the virtual machine, so the virtual CPU cores, the vCPUs, or the second option to license based on the physical host CPU cores. What's the difference? Let's imagine you have an Hyper-V host with many physical cores. Let's say a high-end Intel server, latest generation, and you have in this host 80 cores. Then for sure, you need to license 80 cores for Windows Server 2022 to have the usage rights for Windows Server. Let's imagine we license Windows Server Data Center, so unlimited virtual usage rights. And now we are running only a few virtual machines on this high-end hypervisor with a few virtual CPUs. It could be maximum 24 per virtual machine. I will explain why. And in this scenario, we could decide to go for licensing of virtual machines. Not licensing the 80 physical cores in the host, but licensing the virtual CPUs, the vCPUs, the virtual processors in the virtual machines. Here it's important to know that the minimum amount of cores we can license for each server is 4. So this means this first virtual machine is very inefficient because we configured this in this picture here with 2 virtual CPUs, but I have to license 4. So I could have better performance, better scalability if I would configure 4 virtual CPUs for this machine, because even if the machine only has 2 virtual CPUs, I have to license 4. This is the minimum for SQL Server. The second virtual machine has 4 virtual CPUs. I have to license 4 here. And the third virtual machine has 6 virtual CPUs, and I license 6 of them. So in total, in this scenario, 14 cores of SQL Server licenses. Let's imagine I have this high-end Intel host with 80 cores. Then I don't need to license 80 cores for SQL Server in this model, but I can decide to license these 14 cores in this scenario, and I can run SQL Server in these 3 virtual machines. When there will be another virtual machine with, let's say, 8 virtual CPUs, I have to additionally license these 8 virtual CPUs. I don't need any SQL Server client access licenses here. For sure, I need the Windows Server client access licenses, but no SQL Server client access licenses here. The second option, this option is available. Option number 1 is available with standard. Then the virtual machine can have up to 24 virtual CPUs. This option is also available with enterprise, and then for sure a virtual machine can have more than 24 virtual CPUs. The second option, where I decide for licensing the physical cores on the host, is only available in enterprise with software assurance. And this means I will license all the physical cores in the host. In this scenario, I have 2 sockets with 6 cores in each socket. And now I will license 12 cores with SQL Server. And now I have unlimited virtual usage rights. Here we can see 6 virtual machines with SQL Server in there. I don't need any additional licenses because I have licensed all my cores in my physical host with SQL Server Enterprise. This option is not available with standard, it's only with enterprise. I've licensed with enterprise with software assurance. Now I have the licensing, let's say licensing flat rate for SQL Server. In my scenario, where I have this ultra high-end Intel host with 80 cores in the host, then I could decide, for example, I have to license all the 80 cores here. So all my physical cores in the host, not the logical CPUs. For sure, with a 4-socket machine, you can have more cores. The typical server configuration actually in the market has something like 24 or 30 cores or maybe 48, but more cores are possible here. Okay, If you have questions regarding this SQL Server licensing, feel free to add this to the chat. We have one question around this, talking about SQL Server. Are there any tips on identifying high potential customers for driving SQL scale? I would address all the customers that are using different database management operating systems, because what we here can see, this flexibility in SQL Server, licensing with a SQL Server license and additionally CALs, the client access licenses, or deciding for virtual machines to license based on the cores, or deciding for the physical host based on the cores, is an exclusive licensing advantage of SQL Server as far as I know the market. Different database management operating systems are usually less flexible. This means many of them only allow to license the physical hosts. Many of them require to license all the physical cores, even if I'm only running one virtual machine. And SQL Server got really enterprise grade in the last versions. So SQL Server 2019, 2017, 2016, they are high scalable, high available in combination with the always on functionality, really always on and available. And this means every customer that's running any databases is a potential SQL Server customer. Traditionally, we have the situation that in high-end scaled environments, in virtualized environments, customers often decided for different database management operating systems. Today, the advantage is here really based on the licensing. So these are the customers you could try to identify if they are using any database related technology, and then recommend SQL Server and present and explain the flexibility of SQL Server around the licensing. What's important, if we are running SQL Server inside a cluster, we need the software assurance for SQL Server to have the licensing mobility, to be allowed to bring the virtual machine with SQL Server to another host. Because an advantage of software assurance is to have the licensing mobility here for the server applications, not for the server itself. For Windows Server, there's no license mobility. Even not if you decide for licensing with volume license in software assurance for Windows Server, there's no licensing mobility there. So if you are running a cluster, you have always to license all the nodes with Windows Server, standard or data center, in the amount of cores you need to be accordingly licensed regarding the number of your virtual machines and your workload. For server applications like SQL Server, like Exchange, there you have the software assurance to bring the license mobility to this server application. If there are any additional questions about SQL Server licensing, feel free to ask, because there's a great licensing document where you have additional information about the licensing of SQL Server. It's the licensing data sheet of SQL Server, because what's also interesting here in the SQL Server licensing, if you are running passive, the important thing is to highlight the passive instances for high availability or for data recovery. You don't need any licenses for this passive. You don't need any SQL Server licenses. Important note: any SQL Server licenses for these passive servers. Passive means I cannot access the database with a user workload, but I can switch from the passive to an active mode if a failure occurs, if an if we have some outage of any hardware or software components. And as you can see here in this scenario, we have totally 48 cores where SQL Server is installed and available. We have 12 cores that are active. We have 36 cores that are passive, so they are waiting for the time where they are needed for failover. And in this scenario, we only need 12 cores to license. This is an interesting thing. Is an interesting thing in SQL Server for data recovery scenarios. Okay, so I mentioned or I reacted to the question about SQL Server and identifying potential customers for driving SQL Server scale. So the customers that are actually using different versions. Then we have a question, could you share some facts around reseller option kit and channel OEM? Are there any benefits to choosing reseller option kit versus COEM license? So the Windows Server licenses are available in different distribution channels. So the Essentials is only available in the OEM channel. The Standard and the Data Center are available also in different channels. The special thing about Essentials is that inside the OEM channel, the Essentials is only available via direct OEM and reseller option kit. So to explain the difference, the reseller option kit is the OEM branded version of Windows Server. So if I have a server OEM and server manufacturer that is selling his hardware with Windows Server, and where this OEM has an OEM agreement with Microsoft, we have the situation that the installation media I receive is branded by this OEM. So I will see an OEM specific installation media. I will see an OEM specific certificate of authentic authority, so an COA license sticker. It's all branded by this specific OEM. This is a reseller option kit. The COEM, the channel OEM, or maybe some of you know this as the system builder license. This channel OEM license is the OEM license provided by Microsoft. Why do we have this OEM license? Maybe myself, Manfred, is deciding to assemble some servers for his customers. So I could build these servers, I could buy some main boards, a chassis, hard disk drives, and I don't decide for a specific OEM system. I want to assemble this on my own. Maybe the server needs some very specific chassis configuration, something individual I provide exclusively. So it's not available in the market actually. Or I decide to assemble these servers on my own because I know what's inside these servers. So now myself as a person or as a company, I'm not in the situation that I have a direct OEM agreement with Microsoft. So I cannot sell the direct OEM license or the reseller option kit. But I could order a channel OEM license, a system builder license from the official Microsoft distributors, and bring this channel OEM license onto my self-assembled hardware. So the channel OEM license is the license, the OEM license branded by Microsoft, provided by Microsoft, sold by Microsoft. And it enables me as a very small partner that is assembling servers to have for each server a small OEM license. In channel OEM, we have the standard and the data center, but not essentials. Essentials is only available via reseller option kit and direct OEM. So the question was, what's the difference here? The bits and bytes and the usage rights are identical in each OEM version. So OEM is OEM. So if we are looking at standard and data center, where we don't have always to say, okay, essentials is not available in the channel OEM. So when we are talking about standard and data center, then the usage rights. Downgrade rights. We have a downgrade right to previous Windows Server versions in the OEM license. Also, yeah, we can install previous versions. We can build clusters. We can move virtual machines. It's all in the OEM license, and there's no difference regarding if I order the reseller option kit or the channel OEM license. What I always have to keep in mind is the support, because if I buy a server from an OEM, and let's imagine this server has the brand of OEM A. This is the OEM A. It doesn't matter what the name is. It's one of the Microsoft official OEMs. When I decide to order this server with a reseller option kit, then I have the hardware from the OEM A. So the partner number A, or this partner A here, is responsible for the hardware support. And I also have the Windows Server from this OEM. And so this OEM will also provide me the support for the operating system. So my advantage is I have a single point of contact for hardware and software. We can often read that the reseller option kit is optimized for the hardware. This is true for many OEMs, but not for all of the OEMs. From some OEMs, we receive a reseller option kit where we have the branded original bits and bytes. And some OEMs provide very, very intelligent provisioning technologies and deployment technologies for the servers based on the reseller option kit, where I receive driver updates, firmware updates, so where everything fits together. So there we have differences, but with the knowledge that you know, okay, there's a channel OEM, there's a reseller option kit license, you can address your preferred OEM and you can ask him, can you offer the reseller option kit, or can you offer the direct OEM license? This is the third option of the OEM licenses. And what support do you offer? Because this advantage I mentioned, how big is this advantage of the integrated support depends on the support the OEM offers. Is this support by phone? Can I send email? Is it 24 hours, 7 days a week, or is it only 2 business hours? What the reaction time is. And for sure, you can ask your OEM if this OEM has an optimized setup and optimized provisioning of the system. The reseller option kit is an flexible option. So the advantage is, compared to the direct OEM license, that the direct OEM license has to be put into the server, let's say package, when the server is produced. So this means, we know this, Windows Server is licensed based on the processor cores, on the CPU cores. If an OEM produces a server, this specific server we can see here, I will be able to buy the server with 8 cores, with 16, with 20, with 24, 32, 64, and so on. And now the OEM has always to bring the matching license already in the production process. With the reseller option kit, you decide for the right license when you order the server. There are some small differences regarding the country where you are using this license. If you want to have the exact license terms, my recommendation is to use the Microsoft license terms page. I can provide this link in a few seconds. Let's see here. I will create a small banner and provide this. So if you are not absolutely sure about the licensing terms in your country, then you can go for microsoft.com/en-us/use terms. What here is interesting, on the use terms page, you can select the way how software is acquired. we are actually talking about OEM licenses. The question was about reseller option kit and channel OEM. So we can select here for pre-installed on your computer from the computer manufacturer. So ROC reseller option kit is not pre-installed, but it's the same delivery channel. So this is your choice here also for the reseller option kit. Then we have the product name. It's Windows Server. The name for the product is not any longer Windows Server 2022, 2019. It's only Windows Server. The version is 2022. Here, let's say data center and standard. We also have here the essentials. Here we can see these are different usage terms. And we have the 2019 and so on. So we will decide for data center and standard. And then we have the language. And the language usually correlates with the country where you are located, where you are based. There's a specific situation in Germany because of this situation, we have here the license terms in German language, and we have the German language license terms in country. This means if you are a customer from Germany or a partner from Germany, then your license terms are German in country. This means German language and specific license terms for Germany. So now let's take an international version. Let's take the English version of the license terms. And then I can click on Go. And here I will have a link for the licensing terms in the language I asked for. There I have detailed information about the core licensing, about the situation about downgrade. It's in here. This is important. And regarding this, the downgrade rights, for example, for channel OEM, reseller option kit, and direct OEM are identical. The difference is here when we are talking about downgrade, when you are thinking about an Hyper-V host or a virtual host, where you say, okay, I want to install one server maybe with Windows Server 2022, what I have licensed, but another server maybe with Windows Server 2019, then you have the downgrade right in each of these license options, channel OEM, reseller option kit, direct OEM. But the question is how to downgrade this server from the technical perspective. And to downgrade the server from the technical perspective, you need an installation media and a key from the previous version of the server. Maybe you have this already in your company or customer environment because the customer is already using the previous version. If not, we have the situation that the OEMs offer downgrade kits, and the downgrade kit is available in the reseller option kit version and in the direct OEM version. In the channel OEM, in the COEM, channel OEM license channel, we don't have a downgrade kit. We have the same downgrade rights. There's no difference regarding the license terms, but you don't have the option to have an COEM downgrade kit. Maybe you could use a ROC downgrade kit if you have a server from a specific vendor, or in the channel OEM, usually the downgrade would address a customer scenario where the customer is already running the previous version. Why? Because the question is, why will I downgrade? The typical reason where a customer is downgrading to a previous version is where the customer is already running the previous version. And so a good idea from the licensing perspective is to always license the latest version of Windows Server, and then you also can use the previous version if you have the bits and bytes and an activation key. So thanks for the feedback. I'm not sure if this was about SQL Server or about channel OEM and reseller option kit, but thank you. I can see it was understandable what I explained here. And then we had another comment from Sven. He said, could you explain how automatic virtual machine activation works on Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI? So when we are thinking about the licensing of such an Hyper-V host, we have the situation that we see several installations of Windows Server. Let's start from the beginning. When we start with an Hyper-V host, then we install Windows Server on this physical hardware here. And to have unlimited functionality without any time restrictions, we have to activate the server. So we will first install Windows Server 2022, and we will activate the server to unlock the functionality on the server without any time restrictions. If you buy Windows Server for your hardware and you never activate this machine, your server will shut down after a while because the server says, sorry, I don't know if I have a license. So Windows Server is licensed, it's activated, it's a data center edition because important automatic virtual machine activation is only available in the data center edition and for Azure Stack HCI. Now, let's imagine we install Hyper-V on this server, and this machine we activated here is Windows Server 2022 Data Center Edition. It's activated. Now we are starting to install virtual machines. The first virtual machine will be installed here with Windows Server 2022 or a previous version. And this virtual machine has to be activated also. I activated the physical host, and the virtual machine has to be activated also. I could use for activation the key I bought with the host, because this physical hardware has some core sticker on it where I can read the license key. And I used exactly this license key for activating the physical host installation. I could use the same license key for the first virtual machine, but this is not automatic virtual machine activation, and this is not recommended. The better way is to use the automatic virtual machine activation key inside the virtual machine. Now the question is, where can I receive this automatic virtual machine activation key? And the source is docs.microsoft.com. And I will show you a list of keys. And this is not a secret. This is not, I'm not violating any license terms or anything in showing you this page here with the license keys. And this page is publicly available. I will also share the URL to this in a banner I will send to you. So this is the URL for the automatic virtual machine activation keys, where you can get these keys, where you can receive these keys. And when I scroll down here a little bit, I will see a technical explanation. This is one part of the question Sven had. How does it work from the technical perspective? But the first important thing is to see, yes, there are the automatic virtual machine activation keys. I have here the keys for Windows Server 2022, Data Center and Standard. Important. I will explain what standard means here in a few minutes. When my host is installed with Standard, I don't have automatic virtual machine activation. AVMA, the automatic virtual machine activation, is only available with the Data Center edition on the host. In the VM, we are flexible. In Windows Server 2019, we have also automatic virtual machine activation for Data Center Standard and also Essentials. We have the automatic virtual machine activation for 2016 and for 2012 R2. 2012 R2 was the first version that supported automatic virtual machine activation. But I mentioned this when we started with the call. The end of support for Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 will be in October 2023. So here we will have the end of support soon. So it's not recommended from my side to install this previous version in a virtual machine, the downgrade right to Windows Server 2012 R2 is included. So let's imagine we want to install Windows Server 2022 standard inside a VM. Then inside the VM, we use this key here. And I can show this key to you publicly. You can access this key on a public website at Microsoft, because you only can use this key if your host is an activated data center edition. So on this host OS here, we need Windows Server 2022 data center, or we need Azure Stack HCI with Windows Server 2022 data center licensing. I will explain this in a few minutes. So if we have the data center host and we use the automatic virtual machine activation key here inside the VM, then we have the situation that the virtual machine says, okay, let's have a look at the host. And if the host is licensed with the data center edition, then everything is fine and I'm allowed to operate as a licensed virtual machine. Let me show you how this works inside a virtual machine. I will try to show you a virtual machine where automatic virtual machine activation is running, but I have to connect to my demo center. This needs a reconnect via my client here, and then you will see. Okay. Here I have the situation. I have an activated Hyper-V host. I am running an Hyper-V host with Windows Server 2022 Data Center Edition. And I have a virtual machine I will connect to, this one here. We'll have a look at this virtual machine here. And in this virtual machine, I used the AVMA key for licensing this machine. Let's go to the command line. And open the command line as an administrator. I will zoom in a minute. And there's an SLMGR server licensing manager / display licensing information. So to ensure you can see this or read this, the command is SLMGR / DLI, display licensing information. Let's run this display licensing information command here. And I will see a window opens that says, okay, this is an Windows Server. I installed data center in the virtual machine because I planned storage spaces direct things. And this machine is activated via the virtual machine activation channel. There are different channels available. There's a retail channel, there's a volume licensing channel. This is virtual machine activation. The licensing status is licensed, and the automatic virtual machine activation expiration is in 6 days. So this machine was, let's say, reactivated yesterday because this activation is always for 7 days. And the next reactivation will be in 6 days. There the virtual machine will check if my host is licensed accordingly and if the usage period can be extended. So in each of these machines, we can use the AVMA key. And if you have licensed your host with data center, for sure, you can use standard in the virtual machine. And my recommendation is to use standard inside the virtual machine because you can convert from standard to data center without reinstalling the virtual machine. But maybe you will use one time the virtual machine to another Hyper-V host where you only have standard licensed. And when you have a Hyper-V host with standard licenses, you can run virtual machines with standard there, but not virtual machines with a data center installation. This is the reason why I would recommend you to install virtual machines always with standard. If you realize that you need any data center features with inside the virtual machine, then you can convert to data center. It's not possible to convert from data center to standard. So, and in each virtual machine, we will use this automatic virtual machine activation key. And so we have the advantage. We will never have the situation that the AVMA key will say, oh, sorry, I have reached the maximum amount of activations possible with this key, automatic virtual machine activation. We also have the automatic virtual machine activation in Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI will be our topic in the next Tech Talk sessions. So we will talk in detail about Azure Stack HCI. But what's important for you, Azure Stack HCI is running on premises in your environment, on your hardware. We have Azure Stack HCI certified hardware where we can be sure that the Azure Stack HCI is compatible and running. And we have costs for Azure Stack HCI. It's $10 per core per month. In Azure Stack HCI, we don't have included the virtual usage rights. We have a lot of advantages in Azure Stack HCI, a lot of benefits, but the virtual Windows Server usage rights are not included in the Azure Stack HCI operating system. There are two different ways to activate the Azure Stack HCI for virtual Windows Server usage rights. One is we can use a Windows Server subscription available via Azure, or we could use bring your own license with an automatic virtual machine activation. Exactly the same I explained to you in Windows Server Data Center. We have seen this in this short live demo. But the difficult thing is here that the Azure Stack HCI is not Windows Server 2022 Data Center Edition. So now the question is, how can I configure this automatic virtual machine activation for the Azure Stack HCI environment? And I have to connect to another demo server where I have several Azure Stack HCI installations. Let me connect to my host and prepare this that I can show you the Azure Stack HCI automatic activation functionality there. So let's here see the environment and connect to the Windows Admin Center. And I will show this to you in a few seconds. I've authenticate here. It's a new session I'm opening here. And here we have the Windows Admin Center. Hopefully the session did not expire in the meanwhile. So you have many Azure Stack HCI installations, and let's connect to one of these Azure Stack HCI installations. For example, here the Azure Stack HCI cluster. Let's take the 30, the Azure Stack HCI cluster 30. And here in the Windows Admin Center, I have the settings for the cluster on the lower left-hand side. And here on the settings, I have several server-specific settings, and I have also the Azure Stack HCI registration. Important is to know, an Azure Stack HCI cluster has to be connected to Azure. And here we can see this cluster is registered, Azure Arc integration is enabled, but it seems I have some connectivity issues since 3rd of May. So this cluster is not recently connected, so I can sync this one here. I can check this, what happened here, why this one is not connected. But when we now want to activate the automatic virtual machine activation, we have another topic here, the Activate Windows Server VMs. When I go to Activate Windows Server VMs, I have two options I can choose between. I can set up the activation, and the first option is, what I explained to you, I can buy a Windows Server subscription via Azure, It's additional costs per physical core per month. Or I could use existing Windows Server licenses, and I have the information apply Windows Server Data Center Edition keys to each server in the cluster. This means I check this one here, go to next, and now I have a 3-node cluster. Azure Stack HCI starts with 2 nodes. Here I have a 3-node cluster, and here I could add or enter my 3 data center keys. This must be Windows Server 2019 or later. So it cannot be 2016 or 2012 R2, but 2019 or later. So if we add 2019 data center keys, our virtual machines on Azure Stack HCI can be Windows Server 2019 or previous version. When we enter 2022 keys, our virtual machines can be 2022 or later, because we always have the downgrade right. And now I would enter for each server the data center license key I have bought for this specific server. For example, via reseller option kit, what we discussed before. So the automatic virtual machine activation here for the Azure Stack HCI operating systems. So feel free, we have some minutes left to put your additional questions to the chat. We have one open question, it's a little bit longer. We here open license has been gone end of support. How would guide customers who are open to modernize the infrastructure, and what things, options should they consider as they modernize? Not every open license form is end of support or expired. We have several open versions, several open licenses that still are available. So an open license is it's specifically for open license. Yes, now I see this. So let's talk about volume license and OEM license and maybe the new CSP licensing. So you have different licensing options for Windows Server. For Windows Server, the good thing is that we don't have to discuss about different usage rights we have in the different license models, because in Windows Server, we have the full functionality in every licensing option we use. It doesn't matter if we use any volume license, and volume licenses are still available, or we are using OEM licenses. We discussed the different OEM license topics, or we are using the CSP licensing. We have always a full-featured product with all the functionality. We have the same downgrade rights. We have the same capabilities inside a cluster. We don't need software assurance for Windows Server to operate a cluster or things like this. But for sure, we have advantages if we add a software assurance like technology guarantee, like licensing guarantee, and things like this. And yes, we still can add software assurance also to OEM license. So the specific question was, how could we modernize our environment? And when we are talking about modernization, I will come back to this topic we had regarding the Azure Stack HCI, because Azure Stack HCI is the best way to modernize the environment, because on Azure Stack HCI, we have the situation that we can run Azure workload, but this does not mean that we have to leave our previous licensing path. So we can decide, as we have seen in my live demo, to go for the OEM license, or to go for the CSP licensing, or to go for a different volume license, to license the hosts to receive a specific workload. So my recommendation from experience from the field is to always look at the OEM license provided by your hardware vendor, because of this single support contact we discussed before when we had the question about the difference between the channel OEM and the reseller option kit license. So a big advantage for the customers is to have the single point of contact. You also have the single point of contact for hardware and software. If you add an additional support contract from Microsoft, this is also available. So we can, especially for Azure Stack HCI, add an Azure-based support, but we also can add support with specific support agreements we can have with Microsoft. And this is my recommendation to ensure that we have a licensed scenario where we don't only look at the correct licensing, but also that we have the full support of the stack. And there, the reseller option kit is an interesting option, and also the direct OEM license is an interesting option because the OEMs provide the direct support for this. And maybe if you didn't know this, Windows Server is since a while already also available in the CSP licensing as a subscription or as a perpetual license if you decide for this way. Okay, so we are at the end of our planned time for this support call. Thank you for your time having been here. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for listening my explanations of SQL Server, Windows Server licensing. I'm looking forward to have you in the next Tech Talk call on May the 16th, when we are talking about Azure Stack HCI, the concepts and benefits. Thank you for your time. See you soon. Your Manfred. Bye.